I now call upon our last speaker for this session,
Merci
Dr.
beaucoup,
Susanne
je vais
Quadflieg.
maintenant appeler
So
Susanne.
Susanne has been a senior
On va
lecturer
devenir
in
Susanne.
experimental psychology
Susanne
at the University of
est
Bristol
spécialiste
since
de psychologie
2015.
expérimentale à l'Université de Bristol
And she
depuis,
oversees the
2015.
Person Perception and Person Knowledge Lab, the PPPK lab.
Responsable du laboratoire.
And before that, she was a postdoc researcher at the
Belle.
University of Louvain
Avant
in
ça,
Belgium,
elle était chercheur
and
à
worked
l'Université de
as an
Louvain, en
assistant
Belgique.
professor at the New
Et
York
elle a
University,
travaillé en
Abu
tant que
Dhabi.
professeur
So research in her lab explores how people perceive and navigate their social world and try to understand how people try to make sense of each other. And she studies the science of people watching, and you will know very soon what it is. Susanne, thank you very much. The mic is yours.
De quoi il s'agit? Merci.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. Thank you, Christiane, for inviting us and for putting this event together and not giving up despite the pandemic. I think we're all very excited to be here. And I'm going to talk about categorization biases in rapid impression formation. So I hope I can now make the connection between what the first speaker said, that we generally have biases in our world and how we process the world, and apply it a little bit more to how it affects how we interact with people and how we form impressions of people. So when I talk about the process of rapid impression formation, what I refer to is a mental leap that we all engage in every day. When we meet other people, usually within seconds, so very quick, we form impressions of them. And these impressions involve a leap because we usually extract very quickly visual information about them, how they dress, what are their emotional expressions, what is their body posture, how do they move, and where are they looking. And we use this visible information in order to draw inferences about invisible states. What are they paying attention to? What are their emotions potentially? Which personality traits are they maybe having? And of course also which categories do they fall into? And I want to emphasize here, this is our judgment of what they are. So is it my perception whether this is a person, is a man or a woman? It's not about how they may self-identify. And of course we refer to this as psychologists as a leap because you extract from visible information, you make a jump to draw conclusions about invisible information. And when social neuroscientists started looking at this question, they also could show not only is it a leap that can be accomplished very quickly, but actually it's quite a complex task for your brain. So we now know that there are several networks involved in making these types of judgments. This is a bit of an oversimplification, as you can imagine. But we know there are at least two networks that get involved. One that is really good at extracting this visual information, one is the person perception network, and one that really starts to then mentalize about what is going on in other people, what are these mental states. And this is called a mentalizing network, not surprisingly. Irrespective of whether you take a primarily psychological perspective or a neuroscience perspective, I think most research will agree that these rapid impressions that we form of other people are pre-reflective because they're so quick. It's not like you're sitting there thinking this through. They're very error-prone because, as I just explained, they're often based on information that doesn't match the conclusion that you're drawing. But, and this is a little bit where I contradict our first speaker, they become so dangerous, and that's not talked about enough, because they are often consensual. So it's perfectly possible that we form a wrong impression of another person that wouldn't be that harmful if I would be the only one in the room. But we all come to the same wrong conclusion. That's when problems become really real problems, because then that person will be affected in a very systematic manner. And that is what we often see with impressions about other people, that we are all getting it wrong, but we're getting it wrong in the same way. So this is what we refer to as consensual bias. Another thing I want to point out, which I think Wim already touched upon a little bit, often the idea is that if something is rapid, it must be implicit. But actually it's not that simple, and I really recommend, if you want to learn more about it, to read some papers by Bertrand Gawronski. But not everything that is rapid is unconscious or uncontrollable or unintended. Yeah, and that's what I want you to keep in mind. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I'll give you an example in a second. Another thing I want you to consider is that, of course, once we talk about biases and rapid impressions, there's a whole world out there that has nothing to do with people's categories or the categories we think they belong to. But of course, in today's workshop, we are focusing on biases that are based on categories. So what you see in the real world is often that these biases based on categorization are actually getting intermixed with other forms of biases, and that's just something to keep in mind. But from now on I will focus on categorization bias, and you can already see that I refer to it as a plural here, because actually bias that is related to the categories that people belong to comes in very different forms, and in a way it's a multiple set of biases that can be activated. What these biases have in common is usually that identical behavior in other people gets either interpreted differently, evaluated differently, or attributed differently, depending on the groups that we think these people belong to. And in everyday life, the groups that matter are often the ones that we can very quickly extract from other people. And so it's not a surprise to know that age, race, and sex are particularly important categories. And another thing that is often not talked about is it's the intersectionality of these three. Yeah, so how you perceive an old black woman is very different from how you perceive a young black man, for instance. Nevertheless, our research is often still stuck on just looking at one at a time. To now give you an example of how rapid impression formation acts in real life is that most of us probably have encountered occupational stereotypes. And they exist with regard to race, age, and gender. I'm just giving you an example for gender. Because we have beliefs about the groups that we think people belong to, such as men and women, we often have expectations at what these people may be good at or what they are suited to do in their professional life. Women are often thought of as being domestically skilled or having a sense of ethics and beauty, being very nurturing. So we very welcome them in roles like being a florist, being a cleaner, looking after kids, being a nanny. And men are often thought about more like they have to do the tough intellectual work, they have to take responsibility, or they engage in strenuous physical activity. So they might work as lawyers or as footballers. Of course, the idea is in a lot of Western cultures that many people push, and we will now more and more encounter people in stereotype inconsistent roles. So we may of course encounter a female lawyer or a female football player. And according to the law, in many Western countries, it should no longer matter whether you're a woman or a man performing a certain profession. But we also know the reality looks different. People who work in stereotype inconsistent roles often earn less, have less successful careers, report more stress, are less satisfied with their job. But the question is, of course, why? You could say, well, of course, if they are less suited to their job, of course they will perform less and will be less happy in their job. So this is the assumption that these occupational stereotypes have a kernel of truth, and this is just the outcome that you picked something that you're just not good at. The alternative assumption is, of course, well, they may enter a system that has expectations about them that turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. And the entire field of social sciences is basically alive by trying to figure out, well, which one of these two are we looking at here, with regards to gender in particular. But as I said, it can also refer to race and age and other groupings, religious identities and so on. This is a very complex discussion, so of course not a single study will address that. In my field, as I said, we are in particular interested in how people form rapid impressions, and so the very first thing when I got into this line of work as a PhD student was to look at the question, is it still true? Do we actually still care what people work in? Do we still have these stereotypic expectations about gender? So we took these photographs that you see here, where you see they're very controlled photographs, it's the exact same occupations, the only thing that changes the perceived gender of the person. And we asked people to come to the lab to compute a test that is widely known as the implicit association test, a very controversial test in the field, but also a very interesting test. So what it does, you sit on a computer and you see one photograph at a time, and you are told, please categorize whether you think it's a stereotype consistent or an inconsistent person that you're looking at. What is interspersed between these photographs are words that are highly valence. That means they're either very positive or very negative. So a typical positive positive would be sunlight, a typical negative word would be disaster. So you're doing two tasks at the same time. You never know, will the next thing be a photograph of a person or will it be a word? But if it's a word, you have to decide whether it's positive or negative. If it's a photo, you have to decide, is it stereotype consistent or inconsistent? What we as researchers can now play around with is, do you use the same hand to categorize, for instance, stereotype consistent images and positive words, or stereotype consistent images and negative words? And why is that important? Well, the assumption is if you have a negative, automatic negative association with something that you're seeing in the photographs, that should make it easier or harder for you to also categorize the words of that valence. So here we had the basic assumption, stereotype inconsistent individuals still violate your expectations, and for that reason they should have more negative associations. There are different subversions of the IAT. I won't go into all the details, but there are so-called single category IATs that allow you to break down a little bit more how people respond to the different stimuli or items in the task. The main finding that I want to draw your attention to is what you see in this figure. Let's quickly talk about what it shows, because it's not quite intuitive. On the left hand you see a D-score. That's a score that is based on people's response times. Basically what it tells you, if you have a score at 0, it doesn't matter for you whether you have to map a positive or a negative word onto the stereotype inconsistent images. You find it equally hard or easy. And you can see for positive words, that's exactly what we found. People didn't have a preference whether they had to map them onto the stereotype consistent or inconsistent targets. It was equally easy. But for for negative words, we found something different. We found, and that's a deflection from 0, that overall people found it much easier to categorize the negative words with stereotype inconsistent photographs than with stereotype consistent photographs. So that's the first finding. That's the one we expected. The second finding we didn't quite expect, namely that this effect was much stronger, this preferential mapping was much stronger for the male targets. And whenever you see something in your data that you didn't expect, it's very easy to fall into intuitions about what might be going on, and we had a big discussion about it last night. How far can you go in your speculations about your data? So if I tell you now, this would show basically that men that work in stereotype inconsistent roles actually suffer more stigma than women. That could be what's going on. Yeah, it could be that if you're a man working as a nanny, nowadays that's actually still more stigmatizing than if you are a woman working as a lawyer, because we had all these feminist movements that are trying to normalize that women work in historically male professions. So maybe we now need to worry about men trying to access female professions. But of course I want to caution you that our data can't tell us where a bias is coming from. And actually many data that we see on bias have exactly that problem, that we don't know what is the underlying mechanism. So what they do show us is that categories still matter. Yeah, so the identical occupations in that study elicited different evaluative responses for men and women. So that is supported by the data. If we wouldn't have different associations, we shouldn't find any effects. What do the data not show? Well, the very first thing that they don't show is whether this is what happens automatically in real life. Because keep in mind what type of task we gave people. We told them explicitly, we want you to look at these photographs and judge whether something is stereotype consistent or inconsistent. And a lot of people think, yeah, that's valid as a task because that is what we automatically do as we are out there in the world. But that's a big assumption. We don't know what people automatically or spontaneously do, and it depends a lot on people's backgrounds and contexts. The second big question is, okay, we see this evaluative bias, that it's easier to have negative associations with stereotype inconsistent exemplars. But the question is still, where does that come from? That could be a mere perceptual effect, because we still see that women are more often seen in certain professions than in others, and men as well. So it could be that our system is just not used to seeing that type of information. And we often know that if something is not fluent, we're not used to it, that alone can cause negative responses. But that would have nothing to do with our beliefs about these groups. It could just be a perception effect. But of course, it could also be that it is a cognitive effect driven by our attitudes, by our evaluations of these attitudes, so whether we disapprove of someone working in these roles. Or it could be another factor. It could be empathic concern. Yeah, it could be that you look at this poor man who works as a nanny and you think the poor guy will be discriminated against, and that triggers a negative response. You worry. At this point, the data don't tell us that, and it could be that for different people it's different things. And that's important to keep in mind. To make things even more complex is, in rapid impression formation, for many decades, the way we studied these biases was by how do you respond to an individual that you meet for the first time, for instance. That is a very valid question, but the reality is when we meet other people, we often don't meet them in isolation. We often meet them as part of social interactions with other people. And why is that important? Well, because when we draw rapid impressions or form rapid impressions about other people, the relations they engage in with others are as quickly processed as individual characteristics. So, judging the relationship type between people, so what do we think they are they romantically involved, are they siblings, are they family, are they work colleagues, and the quality of this relationship, is it positive, is it negative, also influences our impressions of them quite drastically. And actually it has quite an important effect on our behavior or consequence for our behavior, because it allows us, for instance, the alliances that people have formed around us or that we think they have formed. It gives us reputational insight. So if we see someone in a positive interaction with someone we think is very competent or think very highly of, then we often assume that also the other person shares these characteristics. And another very important feature is that when we observe interactions, we often learn socially. We either learn social behavior and skills. More often, though, what we learn is about norms. What is considered normal and how you treat each other. And so the focus of my lab now is to look at what we call these relational impressions that are being formed very quickly. Unfortunately, we don't currently study it much in the context of gender. We do study it in the context of race, so I want to give you that as an example to explain a little bit more what we mean with biases at this level of a relational impression formation. So we're very interested in how people perceive interracial encounters of other people. And in order to test that, we came up with stimuli, as you can see here, where we created a lot of interactions that involve two people that are mildly positive, like two colleagues high-fiving each other. And the only thing we manipulate is whether they look like they belong to the same racial group or a different racial group. So if they look like they belong to the same racial group, we refer to them as same-race diets. If they look like they belong to different racial groups, we refer to them as cross-race diets. And our very first question was, okay, in most contexts, Western contexts, cross-race diets are still unusual, so that should also be a violation of your expectation. So do we also see an immediate negative evaluation of these types of interactions? So we set out to measure that, but I highlighted some of the problems with the IAT, so we tried to use a slightly different task that addresses some of the concerns, but not all, which is known as an evaluative priming task. So what happens in this study is that again we use photos and words, but this time participants only respond to the words. They never have to categorize the image. All they do is they see positive and negative words and they decide very quickly, is it positive or negative? Before they see the word, however, they now see our images. And the idea is if these images trigger very quick, spontaneous, negative or positive evaluations, that can either interfere or facilitate how you respond to the word afterwards. Keep in mind, this time we are not mentioning race, we are not putting them in a context. If they don't want to pay attention to that, or if it's not something that they spontaneously pay attention to, then it shouldn't have any effect. All we are telling them is, your task is to categorize the words. There are some images before the words, we want you to pay attention, we will test your memory for them, but we don't say anything else. And admittedly, we never test their memory. We just tell them so that they pay attention. So what do we find? Oh, by the way, this is work that was done by my postdoc at the time, Yin Wang, so I just want to make sure he gets the credit for this really nice data set. What do we find? Well, What we expected, what you can see here are the response times to how quickly can people categorize the positive and negative words. Remember, our expectation was that for negative words, they should be facilitated when you see an expectancy violation diet, so a cross-race diet. And that's exactly what we're seeing. You're quicker to have these words categorized following a cross-race diet compared to a same-race diet. And importantly, it doesn't matter whether the same-race diet is a white-on-white or black-on-black diet. For positive targets, we see the effect reverse, so people find it easier to categorize positive target words following same-race diets compared to cross-race diets. It wasn't significant, but you can see that maybe here there's an effect that they find it particularly easy for white-on-white encounters. I didn't mention it, but we did. So the study was originally run in New York, in a very culturally diverse and ethnically diverse city. So this isn't a population, in some rural village. And we had black and white perceivers. We didn't find any differences, but keep in mind, it's very small groups. Yeah, so we might not have found intergroup differences because the study wasn't powered enough to find them. But we found the main effect that same race and cross-race diets elicit different evaluations. This was cool and exciting for us, but again we are left with the question, why is that the case? And trying to get to this question a little bit more. And so we thought, okay, maybe we can use some tools from the neuroimaging insights on rapid impression formation to illuminate what might be going on. Because people have developed tasks that allow us to identify in each person's brain their person perception network and their mentalizing network. These tasks are pretty well established. I won't give too many details right now, but I'm happy to take questions on them. But we basically put people in the brain scanner, we gave them this task, these two tasks, the person perception and the mentalizing network tasks, also known as localizer tasks, because we're localizing these networks. And then, before they did that, we also give them our main task. So they're again seeing the diets. So these are different participants, of course. And we needed a task that was suitable for the scanner that didn't, again, draw attention explicitly to race. So we just asked them, is there helping going on? Yeah, you see two people involved here, is one helping the other. In some interactions, someone asked for directions. There was, for instance, helping. In others, there wasn't. So two people dancing, you would hopefully not think of it as one helping another. So what this allowed us to do is that we recorded brain activity while they were doing the categorization task, and then we were able to look at what happened in these two types of networks. The answer is pretty simple. Nothing happened in the person perception network. Couldn't care less, whether you looked at same race or cross race. But the mentalizing network, generally, most of the regions showed more activity for the cross race diet. So suggesting, and this is a whole brain analysis now, but again it showed the same finding, suggesting that we mentalize more when we see these expectancy violating interactions. The reverse contrast also showed an additional region which is important to highlight, namely that when you saw same race interactions, you activated the ventral striatum more strongly, and this is a region that is often involved in encoding reward, different types of reward, but also social reward. Why is that important? Because it in a way triangulated our first finding. So again, we're showing evidence that there's different evaluation going on with a very different paradigm. So what have we shown? Categorization bias does not only affect how we process individuals, it can also affect how we process diets or groups of people. Again though, the mechanisms underlying this, we've come a little bit closer, but are still a bit unclear. Yeah, we didn't see anything in the person perception network, so you might think, okay, this is not a perceptual effect, it is about how we think about these diets. However, we did find some perceptual differences, they just weren't in the person perception network. So this is now ongoing research in my lab. So I hope what I was able to show you, even though there are many questions left, is that categorization biases come in very different forms and can be easily triggered by people's alleged social categories. They can occur very rapidly for individuals and also diets, and they're likely to have real-world consequences, and that's what we are going to talk about more today. Thank you.